Welcome to Support Life. I'm John Hendriks and my guest today is Denise Cameron. Hello Denise, welcome.
Thank you very much, John, and hello to you.
Yes, nice to have you on our program.
Thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you for coming. Now Denise, tell us a little bit about yourself personally.
Well, John, I'm actually visiting Melbourne. About 2 years ago I relocated. I went back to where I was born, in the Riverina. I was born in the Riverina and I grew up and was educated, and I did the first part of my nursing training in Albury. I never thought I would return, but I did. And I've come down to Melbourne. I particularly came to see a play. The play was called The Execution of Jean Lee, and I used to work, I nursed for 10 years in a women's prison, and I had an interest in the execution of the last woman in Victoria in 1952. So I went to see that last night, and I have a few things to say about that. Fantastic. In relation to challenges that people like me face in today's society.
Yes, of course, yes. And that would have been an interesting play. Very
yes, it was, yes, and it had a very, very profound ending to it. The final words were, what have we done? When they executed that woman. And I was taken by Peter Kavanagh, who was a former Member of Parliament, and his grandmother had actually been active in trying to prevent that execution, and she'd had a promise from the Premier at the time, as President of the Labor Women's Union, that it wouldn't go ahead, but in fact it did. There were 2 men also executed with her in 1952.
Interesting. Well, perhaps we could talk about more of that another time. The professional Denise Cameron, now I believe you're a retired nurse.
Yes, I am retired now after 48 years, but I had a wonderful profession and a wonderful career. I trained at the Mercy Hospital in Albury, which was 4 years in those days. I did a certificate in midwifery at St Margaret's in Burke Street in Sydney, which was a very famous hospital, and I later did maternal and child health nurse. I often say about myself that I've spent a lot of my professional career with women in travail, because I later went on and I worked for 10 years in a women's prison, and following that I worked in tuberculosis control for the health department, which involved a lot of refugees and immigrants to the country, and a lot of mothers and women, and I never forgot the sight of a woman arriving with a baby at her breast from Bosnia at the time of the Balkan Wars, when they were literally forced out of that country with a gun at their back. So I have a lot of empathy for women, but because of my midwifery too, and growing up in a small town, I got to love babies. One of our activities of a Saturday afternoon going to the football was, instead of watching the football, we would go to the various mothers in the town and ask them if we could wheel their babies around the football field.
How beautiful.
So when people ask me about why I'm so concerned about today's babies and unborn children in particular, I think it probably went back to those days. I've always had a particular fondness for them, and of course I never ever forgot the first baby that I delivered at St Margaret's in Sydney. I nearly lost it. It nearly shot across the bottom of the bed, I remember.
Oh, wow.
And then of course I went to England after I'd finished that certificate, and that was when, it was after that that life got a little more serious for me, because in 1967 they passed the United Kingdom Abortion Act, and somehow or other I came across a petition that was put out by the Society for the Protection of Unborn Children, and I thought it was terribly quaint that we actually had a society for these babies who hadn't actually made an appearance in life. And I've often said, ironically, while I thought it was quaint then, years later, I've suffered a sense from my colleagues that I was rather quaint for being concerned about them. But I watched the passage of that bill, and it's very interesting. A year later, the abortion toll in England was 22,000. When I returned to England something like 20 years later, I actually saw them advertising abortions on the posters as I went up and down the escalators in the underground, and I learned that they were doing 200,000 abortions a year. The UK Abortion Act of 1967 was passed supposedly just for extreme cases, and it was put up by Dr. Bourne, who was concerned about a girl who was pregnant after she'd been raped by a gang of guards officers. But by the time the bill got to be debated in Parliament, he was horrified, and he actually joined the Society for Protection of Unborn Children because he never wanted it to be open slather like it is, 200,000 a year today.
That's incredible, isn't it? There's all of these things that say we're going to bring these laws out for the protection and but it ends up being the minority. People, they call it the slippery slope, don't they? They say, well, it's only for the minority, it's only for the extreme cases, but it ends up being
exactly.
So when we return, we are going to have a little break in a moment. But when we return, we are going to talk a little bit about how you got involved with the pro-life movement. But anything stand out in the case of your nursing time, that any of beautiful memories that stand out?
Well, yes, there was a time I've actually written a speech about this, and I began by saying that I've spent a lot of blood, sweat and tears over the cause for unborn children, but it was all worthwhile one morning when I woke up. It was towards the end of my nursing career, and it was really in the final straight, and I was getting pretty weary, and I had a habit of getting up and turning on the television while I had a cup of tea and watching the morning show. And John, I literally looked into the face of an 18-year-old girl who had been in her mother's womb back in the women's prison where I nursed then. And that mother had just come into prison, and she had a terrible lot of problems. She ultimately faced 10 years imprisonment, and on top of being finding herself in prison, she also found herself pregnant with her first child. And I later read in a magazine in a newspaper shop her story, that mother's story, and she said, I wanted to have an abortion, but the nurse here, the sister here, was pro-life. And I did go to quite
just hold that thought, Denise. We are going to have a break. You're watching Support Life. Please join us straight after the break. Welcome back to Support Life. I'm John Hendriks, and my guest today is Denise Cameron. Now, Denise, just before the break, we were talking about the lady that you were helping with her child. Yeah. Can you tell us a little bit about that? What happened?
Well, you said to me what were the highlights of my professional career, and I suppose if I achieve nothing else, there's one person alive today because I was on the scene at that time, and I took a very positive position about that woman's pregnancy, and worked in such a way that I protected her from actually going to the pregnancy risk assessment clinic at the Royal Women's Hospital, and talked in the vein of we're preparing for the baby. And of course she later went on and had that beautiful baby, and she brought the baby back into prison, and the baby lived there till she was school age. And the mother later wrote a book about it, and it was the makings of her. It was the only child she ever had, John. She spent 12 years in prison. So I just simply say, for all the blood, sweat and tears, that perhaps was the highlight, to wake up one morning and see a beautiful smiling 18-year-old girl and think, maybe you wouldn't have been there if I'd not been there at that critical time, split-second timing, when I ushered the mother out of the room so that the doctor wouldn't pressure into having an abortion.
That's an incredible story, and really appreciate you sharing that with us, and an incredible outcome, and no doubt the mother is obviously very satisfied and happy now that you've had the child.
Yes, the pair of them were sitting smiling on the television screen. So I felt pretty weary, but I thought, well, there's some difference that I may have made.
And tell us, how did you get involved with the pro-life movement?
Well, as I said, it was in 1967 in England when I simply found somewhere a petition for the protection of unborn children, and I signed it, and so I started to take an interest in the legislation that went through in England, and I returned to Australia. That was 1967, and by 1973, just after the Whitlam Labor government got in, two young backbenchers by the name of Anthony Lamb and David Mackenzie introduced a bill to legalise abortion in Australia. And I was nursing at the Queen Victoria Hospital. Someone else told me about a meeting in Gore Street in Fitzroy, the Right to Life, another lovely nursing colleague, and we went that night, and my life changed thereafter. I never seemed to have stopped running after those heady days. I came under the influence of a 19-year-old pro-life activist and her boyfriend. They were a very good influence on me, and I suppose in my own mind, I thought that these things came about by governments imposing upon them, but they taught me the value of pressure groups, for example. And then to get on with the history of it all, the bill was debated in Parliament on the 10th of May, and we had a frenetic time leading up to that time, and it was defeated. It's very interesting. Australians should remember that the Parliament of Australia, in our name, voted against abortion, 98 votes to 23. There was an interesting television interview that I participated in with Tony Lamb sometime afterwards, and when we targeted him in the 1975 election, and I always recall he said that the people of Victoria or people of Australia wouldn't be influenced by zealots like Denise Cameron, fanatics like them, and I'd been primed by someone who was better than myself at these sort of things at the time, but I had the last word, and I said, well, did he consider the majority of his own party as zealots, since the majority of his party voted against abortion? It was 98 votes to 23, John. But of course what happened was that by sleight of hand the government started funding abortions through Medicare, and the abortions that were done thereafter were pretty well, it was pretty well de facto abortion on demand until and we held the line in the pro-life movement in Victoria until 2008. It wasn't a matter of there being no babies killed during that time. Yes, 100,000 babies were being killed in Victoria right up until 2008 and since, but we simply held the line. We stopped our parliamentary representatives for putting the seal of approval on this mass killing of unborn children until 2008. And did I mention that I'd been to a play last night on the execution of the last woman in Victoria in 2000 and in 1952 it was, and the final poignant line was, "What have we done?"
Absolutely.
And in 1952, yes. And now what have we done?
Yes, same thing happened in 2008. Yes, absolutely.
What have we done? But many, many more lives.
Yes. We have discussed on this program before the Law Reform Act in 2008, but very briefly for some of our viewers who perhaps hadn't watched our previous shows or didn't know anything about it, very briefly, what happened in 2008, Denise, in the Victorian Parliament?
Well, it all really went back to Jeff Kennett when the people voted Jeff Kennett out of Parliament, and I personally think they only wanted to give him a fright, but they gave him such a big fright, and what happened, there was a flood of Emily's listers into Parliament. For the interest of the viewers, Emily's List was founded by the former Premier Joan Kerner and I think the former Member of Parliament Mary Della Hunty. They went to America and they learned about Emily's List, and it was all about getting women into Parliament, increasing the number of the participation of women in Parliament. But the one proviso was that every one of those women pre-selected by the Labor Party had to be pro-abortion. So they got the numbers in Parliament prior to 2008, and it was in the dying days of the Bracks and then the Brumby government, and there were moves by women who were going out of Parliament, and they pressured Mr Bracks and later Mr Brumby to legalise abortion in Victoria. They went about it by going to the Abortion Law Reform Commission and asking them to tell them how to go about legalising the killing of little babies.
Would you be able to hold that thought until we return? You are watching Support Life. Please watch us straight after this break. You're watching Support Life. I'm John Hendriks and my guest today is Denise Cameron. Denise, just before the break, can you tell us about the things that happened?
How the legislation came about
in 2008.
Well, so that they wouldn't look as if they were responsible for it, the Labor government. They referred it to the Victorian Law Reform Commission, but what they were actually doing, they weren't saying, should we legalise abortion? They were saying to them, tell us how to do it. And there was this facade of asking the public to make their submissions to whether or not we should legalise abortion. Now, 84% of those submissions were against the legalisation of abortion. The morning it was announced that they were going to go ahead with it, a Member of Parliament, a pro-life Member of Parliament, Peter Kavanagh, dragged it out of the then Attorney General Rob Hulls and said, were the majority of submissions against the legalisation of abortion? And he sort of said, oh, well, yes. And he said, how many? And he said, 84%. So it was an absolute farce. And I really don't have a lot of time for all these inquiries because, we've never won one since 1973. So what happened then was that the legislation was introduced, and whilst we had high hopes at various times, ultimately, and the worst day of my life was on the 8th of October, I think it was, when the bill went through in the upper house by only 3 votes. Afterwards, around the side of Parliament, all the Emily's Listers in their purple feminist shirts crowded around Joan Kerner and along with the press, but I did get an opportunity of speaking to the press and said, it was a beautiful spring day, John, and I said, lovely day to be alive, isn't it, for us? And I said that the Brumby Labor government had failed in its first responsibility. Thomas Jefferson, in the Declaration of Independence, said the first responsibility of governments is to protect human life. And the Parliament of Victoria has failed in that first responsibility, and it really does lie at their feet. What have we done?
And on that note, it's been wonderful to have you on our program, Denise. We really appreciate
happy to be here.
Thank you so much. You've been watching Support Life. To finish off our program, we're going to watch a song sung by Anna Cordell at the recent pro-life competition. Watch us again next week. Bye for now.
I see life, I feel life flash before me, rushing through me. I love it so dearly. I want to get this thing right. Yeah, yeah. I need to understand what I can take, what I can make with what I've got here. I need to live without any fear. Yeah, yeah. If the road is falling under me, will you make me a path? If the road is crashing down on me, will you raise me up? If the road is falling under me, will you make me a path? If the road is crashing down on me, will you raise me up? Will I rise? Will I rise?
Thank you.